right. So I'm excited to introduce Kelley Coyner and Jason Bittner. So they're two of our Edge Research Report editors. So far, they've published two with us, one in March and one just earlier this week. And then also they're looking at doing an extensive 11 report series focusing on the role of infrastructure, and how it can play in expanding safe and reliable use of the AVs. All right, so I think we can just get started. Hopefully, Kelley, I don't know if you can either join us in the chat if you can, or if we just want to have Jason answer so we can go along. And hopefully maybe we can figure something out. Sorry about that, everyone. All right, so for starters, we can just start for the first question that we have for you. So there's news. The big news is around the infrastructure and the passage landmark infrastructure legislation funding. So where do infrastructure readiness for AVs fit into this? And Jason, if you just want to start for this question.
Yeah, thanks, Beth Ellen, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this. As you might guess, we had sort of taken a stab at how we might individually answer this question, and then kind of put that together as we were moving forward. I think that one of the primary issues associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the way that it's set up is that there wasn't as much specific reference to vehicle automation as we might have expected to see in a new transportation authorization bill. There's really nothing specifically written that would help advance this subject, but there are a lot of pieces around safety research, around planning, around accommodating future vehicles that are in the background on all of this. There's at least a desire and some nod in the safety programs and in some of the grant programs, like the Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation program, which is about $1 billion program for issuing grants to cities and communities to engage in a whole host of improvements across their infrastructure. That program has an element of potentially accommodating infrastructure improvements to deploy new technologies. So while nothing specific, there's a number of hints at how communities in particular can access funding to help prepare them for the future. So we know that there is continued interest on behalf of the U.S. Department of Transportation in advancing these technologies, and we know that the public is, of course, very keen as well in understanding what the future might hold.
Great, thank you. And I guess Kelley,
and I just saw Kelly's mute dropped. Do we have her at all now on there, or we still don't have her? Oh, okay.
No.
Okay. Sorry.
But she did comment in the chat that there's also a lot of investment in road quality and also investing in the connected and electric charging.
Yeah, and just to expand on that too, I mean, the starting point of any mobility option for people are high quality roads in a state of good repair. So thanks for reading me back in. That's usually the area that I go to first, and so I appreciate Kelley dropping it in the chat there.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And then I guess so too, right? So different types of communities, right? Within the Infrastructure Act, it reflects that different communities have different needs. So similarly, cities have different issues when it comes to AVs and operating environments infrastructure. So how will the big and congested metropolitan areas deal with a mix of human-driven vehicles and AVs? And then also there's the need within rural areas. And where does the infrastructure fit within those two areas?
And definitely there are two very different different scenarios. I mean, if we want to start with thinking about the rural environment, nearly 2.5 times more fatalities happen in the rural environment due to crashes than in urban environments. Some of that's because of higher speeds or other issues related to impaired driving, which are more prevalent in those rural areas. So thinking about what happens in those rural areas too, they're also the places where you have maybe the most inconsistency in lane marking, or you have 2-lane highways that are really designed to be relatively low volume, but they travel at high speeds. It's where the bulk of those high speed collisions and even single car accidents occur in those rural areas. So certainly vehicle automation, by ability to remove sort of the human elements of some of those crashes, would be a primary place where we could see improvements. And if the infrastructure is prepared to have vehicles operate in those rural environments, either through improved lane markings or removal of some obstacles on the sides of the road, then you certainly have an improved situation in those rural areas. It's important to note too that in especially the rural areas, that's where you really have a lot of unusual cases where AV developers need to maybe have a different approach to handling some of those problems. You can have everything from farm implements on the highways to single lane bridges, or definitely situations where you have humps in the roadway that you need hump removal to improve safety. And any of those kind of safety improvements that can be done have the tangential benefit of improving safety for the human environment as well. Back in the city, in the urban areas, we have to accommodate a slew of other roadway users, and particularly vulnerable roadway users, bicycles, pedestrians, and other transit vehicles that might be operating on the same roadways. So the infrastructure mix looks a little different, of course, in the urban areas.
Kelley, thanks, Jason. Kelley, maybe you said that you think it's on. I think I hear some background noise. So
can you hear me?
Yes.
That is awesome.
I played the role of Kelley Coyner for long enough. I'll give you the real thing.
A friend of mine who used to deal with the huge data center said, and when in doubt, just keep turning it off and turning it back on. So there you go.
Right? Just reset button always works.
Right. Thanks so much. I'm glad to sort of add to what Jason has said about the difference between cities and rural areas. And I think that the key piece of this is a concept that we talk a lot about in the world of developing these automated vehicles, which is the operational design domain, or the operating environment, to be used regular language. In the city, you have a really complicated one. And what Jason described is really typical of sort of what we think of as regular surface streets and not facilities that are limited access. In rural areas, you may have the same issue once you go off of those facilities, but you tend to have access to roadways that have better quality of the roadway. If they're interstates, they're more likely to have lane markings. Those are really important. But one of the things that we've encountered as I've worked on deploying passenger vehicles in this area is a lack of access to broadband. And so the lack of ability to have any kind of connected technology or infrastructure to support it becomes really important.
Makes sense. Thank you, Kelley and Jason. All right, so let's assume that we can make infrastructure changes. What infrastructure modifications can be done right away to avoid the confusion and possibly even accidents. Jason, if you'd like to take this one.
Yeah, and right off the bat, the simplest infrastructure improvement that we've been able to identify that can enhance both automated driver assistance systems that are in currently human operated vehicles and future automated driving systems is really an improved lane demarcation. So paint thermoplastics, more consistency in pavement markings. Better lane markings benefit everyone. They benefit the human driver, and they certainly benefit the ability of machine vision to interpret what is on the roadway. It's really one of the first infrastructure changes that I think are things that the current infrastructure owners and operators, the state governments and other jurisdictions that own the roadways can implement today that will improve not only the safety of the current traveling public, but also then as technologies are deployed that interpret those pavement markings.
That seems simple enough, but you never know. Even like myself, without them, it's frustrating as a human driver. So understandable. All right. So Kelley, the next question I have for you: can infrastructure help AVs, traditional vehicle and pedestrians, cyclists, scooters, move better together and more safely?
Yeah, this is a really hot topic in all the conversations that I've had for probably now about 8 years, and that is, are these safe to operate next to bikes and pedestrians? And so I think the first thing to know is that when you're talking about automation on an interstate, pedestrians and bikes almost are never there. And so that sort of separation of high-speed vehicles from pedestrians and bikes applies whether or not you're talking about a vehicle that's driven by a human being or by a machine. On the service streets, similar things apply that we know in terms of Vision Zero, which is the effort to eliminate all crashes and deaths with bicycles and pedestrians and others, which is that separation between the two of them without impeding bicyclists and pedestrians' ability to use that common space. And so one of the two things that I like to mention to people is that when it comes to bicycles and automated vehicles, riding or driving side by side, bicyclists actually prefer to be next to automated vehicles versus being next to a conventional vehicle. And the reason why is that they're predictable. You know what they're going to do. They're not going to suddenly open a door and knock you off your bike or pull out unannounced into the lane. And so that's really, really important. But the critical thing is that as we design these systems, we need to make sure that both uses can happen at the same time, because what we don't want to have happen is that we suddenly prohibit bicyclists and pedestrians from using trails and city streets that they would normally use.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially like as a biker, I can definitely understand that, like making sure you want to know, like, what is this driver going to do? So I can understand like wanting to be next to an AV rather than a human driver as well. So what about infrastructure issues that are more in the long term? So connected infrastructure, is it dedicated lanes, accessibility? Like how are we in the long term moving forward? Our needs for that. And Kelley, if you want to answer this one as well.
Sure. So infrastructure is a long-term game. We plan infrastructure 20 years in advance in terms of the funding and the planning and the design that we do. That reflects the need to account for new technologies and the like. And so I just want to underscore that the automated vehicle has to be able to operate safely without these changes. for it to be able to move forward. But the connected infrastructure can be really critical in terms of communication between the infrastructure and the vehicle about what those conditions are like, about traffic conditions, about what's changing in terms of weather. And it can also be very helpful in terms of how you manage the traffic by pulling the data from the vehicles into a traffic management system. Accessibility is a really key issue, which is there's sort of two sides to this coin. And when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about the ability of people who may not be able to walk, may use a wheelchair, may be blind, may have cognitive issues, may not be able to hear. So the first thing is they have to be able to use the vehicle, to ride in it and get in it. But the second piece on the infrastructure is that you have to be able to get to it. And we're pretty dismal on that right now. If you think about bus stops, they're typically not wheelchair accessible. They're hard to find. As we work on getting those advantages that an autonomous vehicle can provide to someone who can't drive, we have to think about what the standards are for pickup and drop off, how someone gets to that location to get in and get out, how they can communicate with a vehicle that may not have a human being on board. And so I think those are all critical things, and they're not new issues. A friend of mine who has worked on these a lot, who's a wheelchair user, pointed me to a very crowded area in an entertainment district close to my house and said, "How do you find your Lyft or Uber ride?" And I walk and I can see with the help of my glasses, and I can hear and I can communicate with people. And so what we need to be doing now is taking work that's been done on facility standards, particularly for transit, and thinking about how do we have sidewalks, how do we have the ability to find the place that you pick up and drop off.
All those make sense. Thanks, Kelley. And then what infrastructure issues are important as the AVs become more common on the roads in the future, or in order for there to be more AVs on the road? And Jason, do you want to cover this?
Yeah, and this is where I kind of get a little bit more geeked out on some of the issues associated with automated vehicles, because at my heart I'm still an infrastructure management guy, and the use of the roadway network and pavements in particular to convey people and goods has always been sort of where I've worked in my career. And as we go forward, then we have to really start thinking about things associated with the digital infrastructure for sure, but also physical infrastructure. And as Kelley alluded to in the last segment, the design of infrastructure and the planning for infrastructure is a long-term game. The ability of us to start thinking and rethinking about how we provide for lane width, spacing on the highways, thinking about what it means for how we design bridges and how we can accommodate new vehicle configurations. One of the things that I like to think about going forward is, as automation comes in, and certainly in the longer term, vehicles are, it's relatively unlikely that vehicles are going to look the same way that they do today. If I had to choose, I wouldn't necessarily sit in a chair, and face forward to move between 2 points. I'd much rather have, a treadmill in there that I could exercise on, or that I could sit on a sofa and watch television, or some other accommodation. And that's going to change the way that at least surface transportation would need to look. But that's definitely way down in the future. Things that are more immediate we need to be thinking about are how we ensure that the industry works with us as infrastructure owner operators to eliminate things like rutting, where the same tire path is used for every vehicle, and it would create a dip in the infrastructure, and then you have a rutted roadway like you would see around heavily used areas on bus stops or other places. We've all experienced rutting and what it means then when it rains, and some other inconveniences. So those would be some of the things that we need to start thinking about right now, and making certain that the industry is responsive to some of the short-term problems with infrastructure maintenance. But I like to think about those longer-term issues, like what we can do with lane width, what we can do for pavement design if vehicles are lighter, and what we have to do for bridge design if vehicles are spaced more closely together.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. All things to definitely consider and think about. Makes me think, so thank you. And next, I kind of want to venture into your EDGE research reports that you guys are doing. So you're currently developing a series of 11 reports. As I mentioned, 2 are already published, which are mentioned on the slide below as well. So in the series, what is the focus and what topics are you covering within the series?
So we started with a question about whether or not infrastructure matters in terms of getting these AVs out on the street. And we really, and because we like to tell stories, we start with talking about a project that started in 2018 and how the vehicle was having a real problem with what's called localizing, which is getting in the right place on the pathway that it's on. And in Arlington, Texas, they put up birdhouses along the edge of a path because there was no curb and there was no lane markings and there were no buildings close by. And all my friends in the AD development world went berserko, saying, it was a sign that the AI wasn't working right. But I think what it really illustrated is that we've always needed to have some infrastructure adjustments to help the technology come along. The technologists are very committed to the safety of the vehicles, but we need we sort of look at this sort of question of what do we do right now? And so what we do right now is that we don't take it on and off the interstate without a human being, for the most part. We put in connected signals so that the vehicle can make a left-hand turn. And we think a lot about how these interact with human beings who are also driving. And so that's sort of the overall premise of the series. The second EDGE report, it focuses on pavements and signs, and the ways that the vehicle reads the road and the ways that it could work better, both for humans that are using some automation in their cars or no automation in their cars, as well as automated vehicles. And I think that that one has sort of played out, and the themes grow from there. We look at specifically at particular modes, freight and transit. In fact, we just submitted the manuscript for one on AV trucking because that is really coming fast. And we also look at different kinds of infrastructure because there's a tendency to look at infrastructure fairly narrowly as either being pavements and signs or connected technology. So we will be looking closely at connected technology. That's the ability of the vehicle to communicate with other vehicles, infrastructure, and even with pedestrians. We're going to look at electrification because AVs, it's easier to put on autonomous retrofit on an electric vehicle, and there are tremendous consequences in terms of what the environmental impacts are in the transportation sector. We'll look at things like mobility hubs and transfer hubs, the way that you connect to other systems, and a lot of issues that are important to us right now in our cities. How do we manage the curb? And then the accessibility issue that you just talked about.
So a lot to cover within the 11 reports. So I think that as we're approaching our time here, if you guys have anything else that you want to add or share with the group, or if there's any chats or comments from our audience, feel free to add it into the chat. But if you guys have any other last minute thoughts or anything that you want to share with our group before we can move along.
Yeah, Kelley, I think one thing that I was particularly interested in during this discussion, and one of the prior EDGE reports that you reported on, Beth Ellen, talked about some of these stakeholder tussles. There is disagreement, of course, out there of what the role of infrastructure is for actually causing more deployments or influencing the development of the technology, because there is such a variation and varying standards that different roadway classifications have for things like roadway condition, pavement markings, how they're designed. So I think that the common theme, though, that we have heard is that there is interest in state of good repair. There is interest in making certain that we have a high quality roadway infrastructure out there, and that's for both future automated vehicles and passenger vehicles that are operated by humans today.
Thanks, Jason. And Kelley, you can answer Mark's question. So Mark asks, I do know that we want to kind of wrap up because we have 2 more people, but if you want to quickly respond to Mark. And his question is, what kinds of issues or questions or topics are coming up that may have come from other work that now need to be considered?
I would say that that's a really broad question. I want to invite you to connect with us offline. Exactly. But specifically, what I would say about this is that this has really crystallized a lot of work. We have turned to a lot of others in understanding the state of play in the industry and understanding the sets of issues. And I think what I would say is sort of interesting. The most interesting from other work has really been from the history of transportation. That infrastructure has mattered to the promulgation of technology for a very long time. The first commercial freight vehicle traveled across the United States, and it made it. The internal combustion engine worked, but it took 91 days, and there weren't any roads. They took 5 people, and they had to put down planks to drive over or dig it out of the mud. And then much later, or a few decades later, the electric vehicle was quite competitive with the internal combustion engine, but there was no infrastructure support charging it. We didn't really have infrastructure for electricity beyond industrial factory uses until later. So I think that the thing that we're learning is that there's historical precedent, and I guess what we're trying to work from is to not repeat it, to make sure that we really get the benefits that autonomous vehicles have to offer.
Makes sense. Thanks, Kelley. Yeah, definitely learning from mistakes or previous experiences. So I want to thank both Kelley and Jason for joining us today. And I'm really glad we were able to figure out our audio and technical issues. So thanks again for joining us. And the EDGE research reports the 2 that they have today that are published out of the 11 are listed below.